Die Urkunde sagt, die Diploma says, Urkunde, die Universität zu Köln ernennt Herrn Professor Dr. Bruno Latour, Professor à Sciences Po Paris, zum Albertus-Magnus-Professur 2015, Köln, den 1. Juni 2015, der Rektor der Universität zu Köln, Professor Dr. Axel Freimuth. Thank you very much.
What do I do with it now? Right now, steps over there for if someone takes pictures? Or?
Right now, I lay it there, sure. And afterwards you can.
Thank you very much for the rector, for Professor Speer. I was somewhat expecting that it would be in Latin, though. I'm slightly disappointed. It's very honorable and, of course, very disturbing to be linked to Albertus Magnus in any sort of ways, especially on a topic which is certainly not a topic that he would have had to absorb, namely governing the climate, which is the topic of today. What I'm going to do is, of course, not to mention and speak of the climate conference as a political scientist, but to try to interest you as a political philosopher of nature. That is, what happened when we have to deal with topics which have really no connection with the topics of the past, because now we have to absorb all those elements which were formerly about nature, non-human, as I call them, and as the rector and Professor Speer reminded you of. What I'm going to do is a three-part talk which goes from more and more to more and more practical question. And I'll start with something which might look very abstract, a problem of political philosophy of nature, and then I will spend some time on the difficulty of this question of how to govern the climate, because as you know, there is this big event in December in Paris of the climate conference, the COP, and every time there is a COP, some hope are being sort of arising, and some disappointment is also prepared, unfortunately. So this is why, in a very, very practical way, in the third part, as the rector anticipated, I will use the example of a simulation we did to draw a few lessons on how we can deal with it. And I don't have a written paper because all of those things happened 2 weeks ago, and I hope you will accept my English, and I put a lot of things on the slides so that it's easier for you to follow. Now the first part starts with a question which I cannot possibly develop too much around this notion of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a geological label, but I will use it in these lectures as a political philosophy question. The Anthropocene, and I don't know how much is it known in Germany, I'm sure it's known among the scientists among you, or those who follow the excellent demonstration and exhibition which had been in Berlin last year, the Anthropocene Observatory. It is a term which in fact is exactly the sort of thing I've been working on for 30 years, namely the connection now explicit, understood by everybody from geology to economics, about the link between the humans and the non-human at a scale and at a dimension and at an intimacy which, of course, no one had anticipated before. In my wildest dream, when I was starting in laboratory life, mentioned earlier by Professor Speer, I could not imagine that I would live old enough to hear and read these things in Nature a few months ago, which is the human epoch defining the Anthropocene, and having this strange image coming on the cover of Nature, the sort of image which was, at the time when I started my study, a nightmare for the scientist I was studying, namely the mixing of social, cultural, historical, and scientific things together. I was, at some point, even though people never actually read seriously what I was writing, called a relativist. Now, what is this? It's called the human epoch. It's on the paper called Nature, and it's invent this strange character which is more than a hybrid, but a sort of fusion of all sorts of things. You can see nuclear plant, you can see forest, you can see caravel from the colonization, early colonization, all mixed up with the ground and the underground and the mining in between. So now I take as absolutely obvious that the question of the Anthropocene summarized what was at work in the science and technology studies for many years, namely that we have to deal with those hybrids in some ways. The problem is that we don't have a politic that goes with it. So we are exactly at the same sort of situation where we were in the 17th century when the notion invented by Thomas Hobbes in the famous frontispiece of the Leviathan was trying to invent a new definition of a polity, a new definition of a sovereignty, a new definition of a territory, and of course a new definition of the interpretation of the Bible to avoid the religious war. Remember that Hobbes was trying to find a solution to the religious war, and also an interpretation and an exegesis of a scientific truth. In the case of Hobbes, the absolute certainty which was associated with mathematics, and as you might remember, with the teaching of Hobbes himself. Now, the reason why I put these two figures is that we have a very elaborated tradition of political philosophy for the left figure, and for the other figure, the one on the right, the one which is just coming to us, we are completely deprived of any sort of concept and any sort of way of understanding this sentence. What could it mean to govern the climate? You remember that in Hobbes, the state was out of the state of nature. It was the way to get out. An order by law invented by the polity and the great Leviathan. And we are moved on the right, not in a state with a big S. We have no state to understand and to govern and to rule over this new situation. We are actually in a state of war, a state of at least dispute and conflict about how to handle this vast variety of entities. Even between the French and the German, there is a dispute and a conflict about coal, which you use a lot, and nuclear plant, which we use a lot. Just a small detail, but I mean, all of those questions are actually conflictual, and they are part of controversy. There is, of course, something like a political movement. There is a vast number of people who are trying to make political those issues. You see this is from the demonstration, the biggest demonstration in Manhattan in September 2014, and you see some people who ask climate action now, stop wars for oil, and especially this slogan, which I like very much, which says, we know who is responsible, which is a way of attributing a political finger, directing a political finger to those who are responsible, which probably in this case are the big oil and coal companies. What is so interesting is that we have a political movement, but we don't know how to handle them at the level of a state. If by state we mean something which would have the same organization, the same definition of sovereignty, and the same span as the Leviathan invented in the 17th century. Why? Because there is no overall dome, there is no overall authority which can adjudicate those disputes. We may actually believe that when we are working against the nuclear plant, or for the nuclear plant, or for the maintenance of soil, or against the disappearance of species, that we are actually sent by a sort of overall authority. But the point is that this overall authority, none of them is actually recognized as such. There is no even virtual world government, and of course this is not what the Conference of Parties, which I will study in the next part, is about. There is no world government who can say, you do this, you do that, you Germany, you stop using coal, you China, you stop using coal, etc. There is no way to be to have a word government. We don't even manage to have a word international criminal court. Nature, and that's a great surprise, and of course something which had been discussed in the medieval age and probably a lot by Albertus Magnus, nature does not unify. And that's a great discovery of an ecological dispute. It's not because you allude to nature that people would agree and say, yes, 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 to defend nature we should do this and we should do that. When nature speaks, she speaks very silently or very disorderly. What about science? Well, science had long been the idea that there would be a sort of undisputable set of laws. This is actually, of course, the idea of Hobbes himself. But something very interesting happened on the way of this sovereignty of science, capital S, and that's called climato-skepticism, which is an artificial building of dispute around scientific authority, which of course did not modify any fact about the climate and the danger of the situation, but had the effect of debunking the authority of science, capital S, as a possibility of establishing order and authority on those questions. So we cannot say, science says thus act. We have, in the case of climate transformation by human, probably what is considered as one of the most uncertain, best documented fact about nature, and it makes absolutely no difference to action. Everyone says yes, 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 and we wait. You could and think, and many people believe, that economics could replace science, capital S, so that there is enough authority about law of economics in order to make us do and know what to do. But if you read any economical literature, you also know that if you have 10 economists, you have 15 or 20 different incommensurable policy about it. So none of those four types of authority are able to unify the decision around those so important elements. And the prime, it's the paradox of the situation, the global of which everyone speaks, and everyone makes these gestures with their hand. We have to think globally, except there is no globe. So everyone knows that it's a global prime, but so to speak, there is no globe which can actually allocate the dispute in political philosophy, even though we think we are, and we are attributing our responsibility, protesting against what we consider as stupidity or crimes in the name of a virtual state. What I call, for this reason, but with two capital, the state of nature, capital S, capital N, as if there was actually a power of unification in the appeal to nature. Of course, we are all simultaneously conscious of that virtual state, are conscious of the fact that it has no authority. So we are in exactly the situation where Hobbes was in the 17th century, certain that you need something like the reinvention of an authority after the demise of the church and emperors overlapping, but we don't know what to do. And that's the connection which is, of course, extremely worrying. This is what could be called the Schmidt problem. I mean, I know it's always very risky to talk about Carl Schmitt in Germany, but the question, the reason why I need it is because this absence of a neutral party. Let me read you the quote, which I'm sure you know by quick. The political enemy is nonetheless the other, the stranger, and it is sufficient for his nature that he is, in a specially intense way, existentially something different and alien, so that in the extreme case, conflict with him are possible. Just accept to hear this sentence thinking of non-human stranger, not only of human stranger, one, and then remember that we are in the period of the Anthropocene, which means that every time we talk about something about nature, it's also us, the humans. So when we talk about strangeness, when we talk about war, we don't only talk now about human enemy. We talk about hybrid entities which are in themselves, even if it's the climate, even if it's CO2, even if it's fish, even if it's soil, something of a human attitude. And in each of them, remember, we know who is responsible. Let me finish the sentence. These, and that's the most important part, the conflict can neither be decided by a previously determined general norm, nor by the judgment of a disinterested and therefore neutral third party. That's the prime of political philosophy of nature. And I can ask you the question, do you, if you are an ecological-minded activist, or a professor, or a teacher, do you think that when we talk about nature, nature is the third party or not? If you believe it is a disinterested third party, you invent this, you think you live in this state of nature, capital S, capital N, and in a way you depoliticize the situation in which we are. And what interests me in this sentence of Schmitt, which I shift to the non-human as well as to the human, is that nature no longer plays the role of a disinterested third party. Even though it's true that the ideal of lots of ecological-minded persons, and in my view, the reason of the failure of ecological parties to develop, at least in France, it's terrible. In Germany, it's better, but in France, it's absolutely awful. They managed to be 2%, and they probably will go lower at the next election. The reason is that they depoliticize the question of nature. And here the quote by Schmitt would apply perfectly to my argument. A world in which the possibility of war is utterly eliminated, a completely pacified globe. You know, the blue planet? Let's think about the blue planet and everything will come to order. We will be aligned in the same direction and we will all work for the good of nature and the earth. A completely pacified globe would be a world without the distinction of friend and enemy, and hence a world without politics. So the question is really this one: is the line that you follow in your interest about ecological question going to the depoliticization of the situation? That is, you imagine that there is a world which actually could unify all of us? Or do you basically accept that there are conflicts every time we talk about nature? Then that's what I mean by out of the state of nature. So, back to the 17th century, the question which is raised by all those questions of climate is this: are we in a state of war or not? The whole invention of 17th century political philosophy, and here I have to simplify, obviously, is we shift out of a state of war, religious war, war of all against all, to the Leviathan, to the state, and law becomes what nature cannot give. Remember Hobbes, how come that nature has not made us more friendly to one another? Because law is what we do. But now we are in a different situation. Now we are out of a state. The states cannot agree on anything about what other encompass them, and we are back at war. Not only the states are at war with one another. There is a famous book by a German historian called The Climate Wars, pretty depressing book. The war of the past. It has three parts: the war of the past, the war of the present, and the war of the future. And every time they are worse. So the question is where we are now in this state of anomy. And the question that I want to raise tonight is how do we get out of that situation? Which means, in a way, having to restart the huge work of redefining everything which had been defined in the 17th century all over again. What is the position for the theos, for the God? What is the definition of a demos? What is the definition of a nomos, the soil? Remember Carl Schmitt's amazing book, The Nomos of the Earth, probably the most interesting thing to do for political ecology, even though he was not thinking of political ecology, of course. What type of knowledge? And of course, what is the distribution, what I call a cosmos or a cosmogram, among all those entities? Now, be reassured, I'm not going to talk all about this question. I move now to the second part, which is about an application, a situation of political science this time and not political philosophy, where all those questions, which are huge questions for every philosopher, anthropologist, political scientist, are raised but in a very practical manner. The trouble with the conference of parties. This is the English expression. It's called the COP, and the one which we are going to welcome in Paris is the 21st of them. As one of the students who was at the simulation said, she was 21st, she was 21, and she said, for as long as my life, those people have been discussing in those COP every year, and nothing very much came out of it. So I'm here simplifying for you a very important book in French by two of the best observers of the COP called Gouverner le climat, with a quotation mark. What does it mean to govern the climate? The question which I ask in the first part in a very philosophical manner. The difficulty is that it's global without a globe. There is no state, and yet everyone behaves as if there was some sort of a state which is represented here by the small and very important procedure of the United Nations. There is a science, and the IPCC, which is the body of scientists which have accumulated and invented a very original institution, a bit diplomatic and a bit scientific and a bit political, in order to gather all this information in three different domains: the science, the policy, and the remediation. It's, of course, a very, very important body, but it does not, of course, have any sort of definitive authority. And third, it works on the idea that it's a state question. 195 states, as if the states were actually the one who could handle those things which are also said to be global and international or transnational. So there is a great difficulty in defining the COP, especially because, and this is well articulated by the two authors of the book, Stefan Eikut, a German, by the way, an excellent researcher, and Ami Dahan, that the states which are dealing at this COP are not dealing with the causes of the phenomenon of climate, but only with the consequences. And that's a very odd way of organizing the negotiation. The CO2 in the atmosphere, if we summarize this as a CO2 question, even though it's slightly more complicated, is a far away consequences of action which are taken by any government, actually by any one of you, every day. It's the causes are coming from decision about what sort of energy mix we will use, how we will reorganize harbor for transportation, should we build cars or trains, what are we going to eat, how are we going to clothe ourselves. All these decisions about how we build our daily life are the causes of which the far away consequences is the CO2 in the atmosphere. This is a fascinating aspect of the discussion between science and politics. The politics followed the CO2 emission. And it's true that the CO2 actually spread in the atmosphere and is fairly, not easy, but feasible to model it on computers. So there is a global CO2. I mean, it's thinkable for scientists to measure, as Keeling does in Mauna Loa in Hawaii, the global CO2 part per million. And you know that the news is not very good at all. But the problem is that it has no political institution for that. Because the causes of that faraway consequences are actually very local. I mean, national, local, depending on cities. And I'm sure that dozens of decisions in Cologne or in the land here have enormous consequence of the amount of CO2 that you emit. But the COP is only dealing with the faraway consequences. And that's the difficulty, of course, for the COP, which made it very difficult to handle a question which is said, again, to be global when there is no world state. Nature does not unify politics. So the question is, do we resort to nature with a capital N, or do we try to repoliticize the question of the climate governance? And that's the question which I'd like to deal with you in a few minutes before going to the experiment that we did. What is interesting too is that when you begin to deal with the causes, there is no common metrics for it. There is a common metric for CO2, and there is now a CO2 equivalent, even though it's not chemically CO2 which is used. So you can have a sort of metric that says you German, you Chinese, you Philippine, you have a quota, or you can calculate the amount of CO2. That's what it makes it so easy. But actually it's very difficult to have any sort of metrics when you deal with comparing the causes. How are you going to compare? Just between France and Germany, there's no agreement on how to calculate your transformation away from nuclear and our transformation into the nuclear. And every time you add that transportation and food and clothing and the way we build houses, there is no common metrics. It's a question of composition of incommensurable world, which is now open for discussion. And actually, Laurence Tubiana, who is the French ambassador and a professor in my school and with the ambassador in the real negotiation, asked all the different countries, very few have actually submitted their proposal, not to talk only about CO2 and how they are going to compensate and how they are going to stay under the limit itself, very, very dangerous limit of 2 degrees, but to describe the way they would imagine to build their economical world in 2030 and 2050. There is no commensurability between the description that the Chinese give of their life and those of Congo, of course. Of course, you lose in incommensurability, but you gain in imagination. And that's the part which interests the Professor Tubiana. The interesting thing, and here I'm moving toward the third part, is that when people mention that it's not only national or nation state that can decide on all this question, they mention a large numbers of entities we call cross-cutting issues, which are not inserted into the boundaries of a sovereign state. And of course, it's obvious with transnational organization, but it's of course fairly obvious with multinational corporation. It's obvious with the scientists themselves. They pertain to networks which spread all over the world. It's true of NGOs. It's true of a very important phenomenon, which is the diaspora, which is itself a consequence of a globalization. The Turk in Germany, the Algerian in France, very important transnational element. And it's true, of course, of, I don't know how to call them, the former entities of nature, which have absolutely no consideration for national boundaries. Everyone knows that. So the question becomes, can we redescribe territorial belongings by taking seriously the fact that they are non-national, that they are cross-cutting? In other words, can we break the idea that there is a globe and the thing is global? We have been completely perverted by this image of a blue planet. When we saw the blue planet, we imagined that we were united. We are more divided by this image than by every other image. And those who are historians and art historians here know that this image has more to do with the God view of the globe than anything scientific. Actually, this image, there is an excellent book of that, was made of endless numbers of pixels, and it's a very, very complex achievement. I put this because, as you remember, there has been an excellent exhibition on the Olaf catalog in the Haus der Kultur der Welt in Berlin. Is this one. There are two solutions to this quandary of non-national boundaries. One is still to dream that we go up and that there will be a sort of world dome, a world a bit like the Reichstag, but a world Reichstag, big transparent dome inside which all the nations are, and which this authority is actually sending position to the members who represent, or to go down. That is, to relocalize, re-territorialize, rematerialize what it is to define a territory and the attachment to the territory. This is what I think would be most interesting, provided we redefine slightly what we mean by a territory. A territory is not bounded by borders. This is an invention which is dating from the Westphalian and the terrible 30 Years' War that Germany had to be submitted to in the 17th century. But it's a very strange way to maintain order in the 21st century. So a territory is more like what we depend on to subsist. Sorry, this is a moving podium. It's slightly disturbing. It goes down and up. Well, down is where I wanted the politics to go in. So I should be careful. what is limited by other territories, but not necessarily by borders. And this is a very, very interesting question of political geography and geopolitics. It has to be represented, and of course it has to be defended. That's the old idea of a territory. So the question which is raised now, and I don't know how many of you have actually worked on that, but I'd like to get the ideas, is how do you represent those territorial limits when they are not like the one on the right, the one we know very well, that is the classical, let's call them Westphalian definition of what is a state and how they actually have borders, and we know how terrible they are and very artificial in this case on the right, or they are something which we have called networks with the difficulty which we don't know how to represent them visually in any clearly interesting way. So the problem now goes down to a very simple but highly, in fact, complex matter. How do you represent overlapping territory? So you see what I mean is that nation-state define their territory, Australia, America, Russia. Everything that we have to discuss in the governing the climate question is cross-cutting their territories, but we don't know how to represent them. Right? We sort of know, but it's always very difficult because it's always running against the question of sovereignty first and then difficult to map. So the situation is a bit like this one, Germany in 1500. It had actually a very nice shape, I find it. Isn't that nice? Here, it's much closer to what we need than the present. I mean, sort of. What counts is the overlapping, the multiplicity. See, imagine, it's not about bishops and prince and kings and marquess. It's about food and then soil and then the question of transportation, and all those questions are overlapping, and every one of them is out of the boundary of a state, but we don't know how to order them. And that's the main difficulty. This is a thing I found yesterday, which I found very nice. It's a New Cloud Atlas, which is representing the practical, territorialized embodiment of all the investment made to have a cloud. I hate the cloud. You know, the cloud which is supposed to be in the cloud, it costs a fortune in terms of infrastructure, in terms of energy spending, and it has actually, someone had the great idea, those guys have the New Cloud Atlas, to represent the territorial print of this unterritorialized or deterritorialized virtual cloud. We need 100 of those images, but I'm not bothering with you. This is a nice one, but it shows the difficulty. This is a French group called Bureau d'Etudes, and it's a pictures of the word government. Now, of course, it's hard to see anything in it. That's the problem. This is why we like the Westphalian state, because at least when you are in Germany, you are not in France after the Kiel, you pass the Kiel bridge, and when you are in Russia, you are not in Ukraine. Well, that's a difficult case. So, well, at least you know when the border is, but when we mobilize and visualize networks, we know it's much more true. A map like that, it's much truer than a geopolitical map, but the point is that we have no visual equivalent as clear-cut, literally clear-cut, as a map. We would need a geological map. This is the Jura. I put this because in our simulation I'm going to mention there was a great geologist, actually the great geologist of the Anthropocene, namely Jan Zalasiewicz, and I complained about this the bad maps that we had, and he said, but why don't you have geological maps like we do in geology? And in geology they are used to this overlapping, to this 3D, very highly complex set of historical maps. And he said you should invent for geopolitics what geology has invented over the last 2 centuries. But of course, Now it's less absurd, because this guy is himself the head of the Anthropocene committee deciding on the name of the Anthropocene. So he sees that the possibility of having new maps is not actually completely absurd. And then I have a nice example of the overlapping of authority, which I found in Holland in giving a talk in Utrecht recently, which is this nice idea of having in Holland a simultaneous election for the one who represent the humans and for those who represent the water. And of course, in Holland, you have no difficulty of understanding why the water is being represented, because if a guy makes wrong calculation, the Dutch just disappear underwater. So the authority, the notion of a double authority on the same soil, on the same land, makes a lot of sense in Holland. And when they vote for one election of humans and one for the election of I'm not sure how you say, Waterschappen of some sort, which is a nice way. See this old idea, which I'm sure Albertus Magnus wrote about, that on the same land you have a Pope and the Emperor. This is very odd. Ah, there is a button. Oh, okay. Okay. Now I've made it out. That you have the same land, the Pope and the Emperor, not in separated not in separated bubble, but on the contrary, exerting different authorities on the same land. That's the key to the question. Okay, do I have a few more minutes for my third part? Now, first part, political philosophy. Second part, the real COP. Now, the real COP, I mean the simulated one, which is an exploration of the alternative procedures. And here I will speak with some exaggeration and excitement because we did that 2 weeks ago and it was a great moment. I don't know if you will share my excitation. We were in a theater, and this is very important for reasons which have to do with the link between the art and the political theory I mentioned before. The theater is called usually the Théâtre des Amandiers, but it was actually debaptized and renamed itself the Théâtre des Négociations. And it rearranged entirely the whole surrounding to welcome a series of students who were designed and elected, well, quasi-elected, to represent entities which were doing a mock-up of a Paris conference 8 months before the real one, but as the rector kindly reminded us, with alternative procedure. So there was, of course, it's a simulation, so we didn't need the 185 nations. We had only 40 delegations of 5 students, a secretariat, and every entity had every delegation had 5 members. One of them was represented government or quasi-government. Another one was representing economical interest. Another one was representing science and soil, basically, I mean, a piece of land known by science. A fourth one, the civil society, and a fifth one, which, depending on which delegation was chosen. Now, of course, it would have been of no interest to reproduce the COP, the one I mentioned in the second part, because it would have reproduced all the limits which I mentioned to you, only nation state, all discussing with the same system about the faraway consequence of their action without taking the causes into consideration, and especially without taking the cross-cutting entities into account. So, why doing this in a theater? Now, you remember Hobbes's frontispiece in the Leviathan. Why did Hobbes ask a friend of the Abbé Niceron to draw the frontispiece, which is so powerful? Because you need to represent the composition when you invent a new political body. And this we needed to do as well. We needed to represent the political body by fiction. When you are in a theater, you can simultaneously dramatize and de-dramatize what is at issue. And this was a very powerful way. You can have a lot of freedom in the simulation, which we would never have before. But the most important thing in theater, and we are all used to that, is that finally the old boring question, how do you dare to speak of non-human, makes no sense. Because on a theater, in any play, especially in the 17th and 16th century, especially play, you have on stage storms, tempest, gods, divinities, animal, monster of all sorts to speak, and no one finds that strange. This is actually what it is to be on stage. So you can do a lot of things in the theater on this question, which we made central for the simulation. What happened to nation-state delegation when they are conflicted, impacted by non-human or non-nation entities, speaking in the same voice? And here's a drawing of the leaflet distributed, and if you look at it, you see that there are lots of delegations which look like humans. Does this work? Sorry? It works. It works? Well, okay, it doesn't work. You have delegation like Algeria. Oh, wait, yes, it does. Algeria, China, the classical one. But look, you have cities. They are in the real COP side event or interested elements which are taken into consideration. Here, they are all parties to the conference. It's named the Conference of Parties. In the text, it's only nation state, even though it's not specified. Here, we decided to have lots of others. Like, for instance, here on top, the atmosphere, soil, endangered species, indigenous people. So we had a great ceremony starting where every delegation came with the same clothing, ties and a dress, formal dress, no bizarre things. The ocean was not full of algae and so forth. You know, it was just normal people. But they spoke on equal ground with the other nation states. So the Secretariat had absolutely no difficulty, which was a great moment, to say European, EU, United States, United States, you have the floor for 1 minute. Atmosphere, you have 1 minute. Soil, do you object to what the Canada said? Australia, do you object to what the atmosphere says? And so the negotiation actually began to represent in all of the sense of the word, represent something which everybody knows is necessary, but no one actually did make, even as a fiction. Not by using Baroque type of fiction, and that I think is one important element, but using very classical United Nations principles. So here you see some of the assembly. United States of America is close to international bodies. Both ladies here represent endangered species, and this one I like very much because they were very influential in the negotiation, is soil. So the negotiation becomes very tense because every time the United Nations of Canada took a decision, soil said, you are impacting on our definition of territory. So we object to that definition of what you do because, for instance, ocean was a very influential delegation because everything the other nation was doing was actually impacting the acidification of the ocean. And I don't know if you know that, but the acidification of the ocean is even worse a threat than the atmosphere climate increase in temperature. So the simple fact of having someone a human, very important, it's a human, a normal human, objecting face to face to something which represents a nation state and say, you impinge on my definition of my territory, and I object in the name of my sovereignty, made all the other nation state not change their mind, but furious. Yes, furious, but obliged to rethink what it is to have a territory. And remember, this is the idea of going up or going down. Up, there is no way. No one abandons one's own sacred interest and egotism. But if you change the definition of what it is to be on a territory, you might change the interest. Because now there's a portion of the nation-state space which is actually depending on the non-nation states. So you change the definition of egoism, which is morally the only thing you can do. You cannot ask people to abandon their interest for the sake of the planet, but you might change what on earth, literally, are you sitting on, which is your definition of territory to defend. And you see we have a geological map I mentioned before. If you shift it slightly to suit geopolitics could work. So some innovation, and I finish on that because I think I'm at the end of my time. Human and non-human are represented at a parity. I've been working on that for a long time, but it's the first time I see it. Basically, it raises no problem. At least not in the sense of having, it's not ridiculous. It's just complex, but every time you have a human voice saying, I represent the undisputable sovereignty of this land, atmosphere, etc., to a nation state, the simple fact of imagining the fiction of having them at equal authority is enough to make the people change. After all, to invent the notion of a people, a democratic people, was a fiction. No one would have thought that before the 18th century, really. I mean, you need a powerful fiction to make that feasible. So it's not the fiction aspect, which is the problem. But more interesting than that, it was not about nature. It was not the old idea, could nature be represented by objective forces? They were not objective. They had their interest. They were partial. And the ocean and the soil and the atmosphere didn't have the same interest. So nature was actually de-aggregated, which is very, very, very important. Nature does not unify, then you should not have representatives of nature. Scientists were spread in every delegation. They were not outside having a voice, which anyway the climato-skeptics have deprived them of. It would not have worked anyway. They were in the delegation. And there were lots of other delegations which are mixed. Cities, obviously it's about humans, but cities are extraordinarily important and enormously influential and artificial entities as well. And I'm sure there is a climate policy of the city of Cologne, which is very, very important and very different probably for the other cities and maybe from the state. So is Amazonia. And Amazonia was appropriated by 5 different states and it had different interests. And most important for the renewal of the argument is the fact that the lobbies, the famous multinational monster, had actually to be in the scene instead of outside acting inconspicuously. And that makes a huge difference, to have the lobbies inside and forced to represent and to describe their own loyalty to their territories. Of course, it's not a contiguous territory. It has the same sort of spread out and highly networky and complex position, but it's very important that when people say we have been the master of the slave, of offshore interest, you are able to represent the territory of those famous offshore. Again, re-territorialize, relocalize, reground, no outside. So, let me just show you for the my own pleasure, maybe not your great interest. No, just a nice point is that this is for the German who know anything about the art. The tables were being invented by the German group Raumlabor. Some of you might know them from Essen. They had invented entire furniture in order to make possible to write and transform each of these tables into a placard when it was necessary. Okay. Sorry, I've finished. Yeah. Sad things happened, of course. The great advantage of being among states is that every state is supposed to be unified. So you have the position of India, the position of America. You are not supposed to disagree and to be disloyal to your state, even though in practice you might not have the same interest. And the student had invented a very, very strange second act, which was redistributing the delegation according to their territory and their interest. And of course, this is the sort of chaos that they were expecting, and they did get it. This is the room where we were. See, for those of you who are interested in the political art, it's interesting that we are in a theater. It is simultaneously a simulation, but on the top of here, on the balcony, you have visitors who are actually introduced by a guide who explains the notion of negotiation, what is the COP, and what those students are trying to do. So there is also a huge civil aspect of that, a public being produced who are actually watching the negotiation and being fed with ideas and information about alternative ways of running the negotiation. This is a crisis moment, fairly difficult, and I have no time to talk about the last innovation. Okay, so it's not unfeasible to have non-state voices. You need a fiction, but remember, to be a democratic people is fiction. So there is no reason why inventing other forms of representation be impossible. What you need is exactly the Hobbes problem of personification. Actually, it's the very technical notion of a Leviathan, it's embodiment of a state. But the embodiment, the notion of personification, speaking in the name of, which he reinvented after a lot of Roman law, etc., is not linked to the figure of human. Actually, he reinvented a figure of a human to be represented, a human detached from its attachment with God and with the soil. So we are just in the same situation, but reinventing other definitions. Basically, what is to be explored is the overlapping of authority. Of course, a huge problem here of how far we want to maintain the notion of undisputable sovereignty. But the question of climate is precisely that this question anyway will have to be tackled. The climate is transnational without being global, because it's global in the final consequence because of CO2 dispersion in the atmosphere, but it's not global in the causes. So there's no sense in opposing the two. What should be reinvented is something around the notion of a new command. And the key invention, and I think the student did it, and they made something with, I don't know the name in English, but I would call constituant, constituting, I mean not simply applying rule, but constituting, political in the Schmidt sense of the word, is that there is no outside in the negotiation. Of course, there is an outside because it's a simulation, but inside the simulation, no one appeals to a command superior. No one appeals to nature, no one appealing to science or to economics to stop the negotiation going on. And I think that's where they invented a way to repoliticize the question of climate, which has been terribly depoliticized. Now, as you know, we don't know how to represent overlapping territories. And fiction is, of course, a crucial element. We are basically back in a situation which would have been found extremely familiar at the end of the 16th century. It's an age of discovery. But the big difference is it's not a discovery of spatial extension. This is why I insist so much on the cartographic aspect. Reinvent a cartography in order to absorb the fact that the world is now bigger and that you have to do something with America being discovered and all the Pacific island and so on and so forth. It's a reinvention of a territory which is the same territory but different, which has a different shape, a different spirit, so to speak. And everything will have to be reinvented. We know that the discovery of the world had influence on everything from theology, music, theater, science, of course, colonization, everything. It will be exactly the same with this new geohistorical extension of the Anthropocene, and I hope we now can come to the question time. Thank you very much.